So, think about this for a second. What if borders were actually living, breathing things instead of just rigid ink lines drawn on a map? Imagine a world where political power pulses, expands, and contracts like a living organism. Today, in this explainer, we are diving deep into a fascinating historical shift that completely rewrote how human beings organize space, authority, and reality itself. This is the story of 19th century Ceylon, the island we know today as Sri Lanka. We are going to explore exactly how the rigid, absolute territorial borders of the British Empire collided with and ultimately violently replaced ancient, overlapping spheres of indigenous sovereignty. This isn't just a clash of armies, it's a story of two entirely incompatible universes colliding head-on. To map out this massive historical shift, we'll hit four key areas today. First, the rajamandala system. Second, the ontological collision. Third, roads, plantations, and taxes. And finally, resistance and the state. Let's get right into it. Section 1. The rajamandala system, the pluriverse of pre-British Ceylon. Before the British ever arrived, this island was not a single, unified state with hard borders. It was a complex, breathing network of autonomous regions anchored by intense spiritual authority. Power in ancient South Asia operated on a system called galactic sovereignty, or the rajamandala system. Think of the capital city as a massive gravitational center, like a sun. Moving outward from this center, a king's direct administrative control might slowly fade away, but his spiritual authority remained absolute. It was a brilliant system, perfectly designed to integrate diversity rather than erase it. Because this world was so incredibly fluid, foreigners were frequently absorbed right into the galactic system. For example, the Nayakar dynasty from South India actually secured their rule over the Kandyan kingdom not just by military force, but by meticulously performing Buddhist rituals. They engaged in a process of Buddhification. True sovereignty absolutely required maintaining this delicate cosmic balance. Section 2. The ontological collision. The 1815 Kandyan Convention. Deep in the lush, practically impenetrable jungles of the Kandyan highlands, a profound confrontation was about to take place. The 1815 Kandyan Convention had triggered what researchers accurately call an ontological collision. This was a clash of two entirely incompatible realities. The Kandyan worldview relied on decentralized, overlapping spiritual spheres. But the British demanded centralized, total territorial rule mapped out with hard secular borders. They were essentially speaking completely different languages of power. When the Kandyan nobility signed the 1815 treaty, they genuinely viewed it as a temporary alliance. Much like two cosmic bodies approaching one another and finding a new equilibrium, they fully expected the British to assimilate into the Rajamandala system and simply take up the traditional spiritual duties of a sovereign. But the British completely missed the point of the galactic system. They firmly believed the convention granted them absolute, undeniable ownership over a neatly defined territory. To them, sacred items like the Dalada, the literal truth relic of the Buddha, weren't profound cosmological anchors holding the entire universe together. They viewed them merely as political tools to pacify local superstitions. Historical analysis shows this violent fusion permanently contaminated the region. The British aggressively dismantled the accommodating, pulsating Rajamandala system. In its place, they forced a rigid, highly centralized colonial state apparatus that answered to absolutely no one but London. Look at Clause 5 of the Convention. This specific text created a massive historical contradiction. The British, explicitly representing a Christian empire, legally bound themselves to protect and perform the sovereign duties of a Buddhist bodhisattva king. Generations of British administrators faced intense cognitive dissonance, forced to maintain ancient sacred rites they fundamentally opposed, all just to keep their fragile grip on the territory. Section 3. Roads, plantations, and taxes. The material transformation. The British quickly moved to physically terraform the landscape of Ceylon, launching relentless road-building campaigns straight through ancient, naturally defensive mountain passes. The British systematically dismantled the indigenous economy in 4 calculated steps. They explicitly weaponized the traditional system of communal labor, known as Rajakarya, forcing the native population to build military carriage roads. They then used these exact roads to enclose ancient communal forests, ruthlessly converting them into massive commercial coffee plantations.
In 1833, the Colebrook-Cameron reforms were introduced under the grand guise of liberal improvement. They officially abolished Rajakaria by framing it as a form of slavery. But in practice, these reforms reorganized the entire island into a singular, centralized grid based in Colombo. They systematically erased ancient provincial boundaries to ensure total British administrative control.
The economic contrast here was absolutely staggering. The traditional highland economy thrived on autonomous chain of fields and communal subsistence, where any surplus was directed by sacred ritual. The new colonial system wiped this out, replacing it with highly taxable, strictly privatized grids dedicated entirely to producing commercial cash crops for European export. This new liberal legal framework essentially just repackaged forced labor. The colonial government demanded direct taxes that native villagers simply couldn't pay in cash. The penalty for non-payment? Forced manual labor on the roads. So the native populations were literally forced to build the infrastructure of their own subjugation, heavily subsidizing wealthy European planters in the process. Section 4. Resistance and the State, from Cosmology to Modern Borders. The imposition of this new, rigid reality did not happen quietly. Anti-colonial fighters continuously and violently clashed with the encroaching colonial apparatus. The Kandyans fiercely fought the brutal enclosure of their world over a relentless 30-year period. The massive Uva Rebellion between 1817 and 1818 nearly drove the British off the island entirely. The British responded with horrific scorched earth military campaigns that devastated the highland population. Tensions peaked again in 1848 when the Matale Rebellion exploded in direct response to oppressive liberal taxes. The new road ordinance shifted an enormous tax burden directly onto ordinary Ceylonese villagers, demanding cash or 6 days of hard manual labor. Meanwhile, they specifically exempted the wealthy European plantation owners. This fundamentally broke native subsistence survival and sparked a massive armed insurrection. But notice how the very nature of resistance evolved over these 30 years. Early fighters back in 1817 fought to restore the galactic cosmological order and reinstate a traditional balancing king. But by 1848, rebels were fighting against unjust taxes within the rigid confines of the territorial state itself. The colonial state had successfully naturalized its borders right into the minds of the colonized. Historian K.M. De Silva really hits the nail on the head here. He points out that the Kandyans could understand authoritarian rule, but they could make little sense out of the cold and impersonal British administration. A society entirely built on intimate, ritualized sovereign relationships was violently shoved into a bureaucratic machine that extracted labor and land with zero traditional spiritual balancing.
The historical record of Ceylon decisively proves a massive point. Establishing total territorial rule required the deliberate, violent erasure of pluriversal ways of organizing human life. The modern territorial state wasn't just some natural, universal step in human evolution. In this context, it was a very specific, forcibly imposed mechanism of colonial power, designed purely to extract wealth and control populations.
So, I want you to look at a world map today. You really have to ask yourself, how many of those rigid lines shaping our modern world carry deep, invisible histories of colonial terraforming? The way we organize territory right now is just one violently enforced possibility among many. It really makes you rethink the whole concept of nationality and belonging, doesn't it? Thanks for joining me on this explainer. I hope it gave you a totally new perspective on the borders around us.